Hi, my name is Dan Pixley. I am a local homebrewer here in Las Vegas and a member of SNAFU and have been for many years now. Um, Jason Coleman asked me to do this video on Kveik in regards to our Kveik beer competition that's coming up. He asked me to give some information on Kveik. Um, I wrote a wiki page about Kveik on the Milk the Funk wiki. I collaborated with Lars Garshall, who is the author of Traditional Brewing Techniques, which is a book that I highly recommend that you check out. So Lars and I wrote this wiki article, and I followed Kveik for a long time now, at least 6 years or so, and watched it come to the U.S. and become available to U.S. brewers. So um, just going to talk about it a little bit and hopefully give you guys some helpful information for your beers for the competition. First of all, though, what is Kveik? Kveik is yeast. It's a certain family of yeast, though. It comes from Norway, and specifically Norwegian farmhouse brewers. In Norway and other parts of Scandinavia and the Baltics and eastern Russia, there are small communities of people, mostly rural people, that have preserved farmhouse brewing traditions as they were pre-industrialization. And as a part of that, some of these farm brewers have kept their yeast, and the yeast is kind of passed down like a sourdough culture. Lars Garshall, who I mentioned before, started blogging about it. He started visiting these farm brewers and discovered the yeast, and eventually had them analyzed by a microbiologist, by several different microbiologists. And it turns out that these yeasts are domesticated yeast. They're very similar in some ways to the regular ale yeast that we use. They're the same species of of yeast. So they're Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And they form their own family within what's called the Beer 1 yeast family. The Beer 1 yeast family is most of your US, English, German, and Belgian yeast strains. Back in 2018, White Labs did whole genome sequencing on their library of yeast and were able to draw this family tree. And Kveik fits within that Beer 1 yeast but forms its own genetic kind of subfamily. And within that subfamily, it's a very genetically diverse group of strains there. Now, it's worth mentioning that there's other types of farmhouse yeast that are not Kveik. They're not related. Those would be something like the Simonitis or the Yovaru from Omega. Those are Lithuanian strains. There's also some Russian farmhouse strains as well. And those would be considered kind of landrace farmhouse yeast, but they're not Kveik. I'm not sure if they're allowed in this competition or not. Maybe Jason will have to clarify that. Yeah, so the farmhouse brewers, they traditionally store this yeast by drying it, which is a kind of a unique property of yeast. Most brewing yeasts don't survive drying very well. But these yeasts, if you dry them and you store them in the freezer, have been recovered after 20 years of being stored that way. So one thing to know about in Norway, they didn't brew all the time because of the water being bad. That's kind of a myth. They only brewed like once or twice a year for special celebrations. And so they had to preserve the yeast, and they did that by drying the yeast. Originally, they did it on wooden carvings called a Kveik ring or a Kveik stock. There's pictures of this on our wiki page. They would just kind of slide the wood across the high krausen and collect it on the wood, and then they would hang it to dry. Nowadays, though, what they mostly do is they use wax paper. You can dry the yeast in a dehydrator at a very low temperature. I'll put it in the oven, but you don't want to get the oven to go above 110 degrees or you'll cook the yeast, and it kind of takes a few days to dry it out that way. Yeah, so that's how it's been preserved. About 6 years ago, I guess, Lars Garshall and other people, a guy named William Holden, a couple of other Norwegians kind of started collecting these Kveik yeast from different Norwegian farmhouse brewers. And then they started to trade them with people in the United States. And I got to watch that happen. It was really interesting. Watch that in the Facebook group Milk the Funk. And eventually we started to see the yeast labs sell them. And what the yeast labs do is they will take these Kveik cultures and they'll culture them out and they'll pick different strains, and then they'll test each of these different strains, which are in the Kveik cultures. They're kind of a mixed culture of Saccharomyces cerevisiae mostly. A lot of times they'll have some lactic acid bacteria contamination in there as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the yeast labs would take the isolates, they would test them, then they would sell the ones that are most reliable for brewers. So that's what you'll get if you buy a Kveik from a yeast lab like Omega Yeast Lab or Escarpment, or Bootleg Biology or Maniacal Yeast. Usually you get a single isolate. Maniacal Yeast actually sells the full uncultured, unisolated, or unpurified cultures, so you can also get those as well. They're just a little bit harder to get. There's some resources on the wiki you can find if you want to go with those full cultures instead of the single isolates. But the single isolates might be a little bit more easier to use, a little more convenient. They'll definitely be cleaner. They won't have any bacteria in them. So maybe just a little more reliable, especially for first timers here. Now, if you do get the full cultures, the lactic acid bacteria are generally very hop sensitive. So you could put like 25 IBU in your starter if you're going to make a starter, or in the beer, and that will inhibit the growth of any bacteria for the most part. Other tips on using Kveik. Kveik is traditionally pitched at a very low pitch rate, like 10% of what you would normally pitch usually, or maybe even lower than that. Escarpment Labs recommends 70% of the pitch rate as a good standard to go with. I prefer a smaller pitch rate. I'll go with something like a 100 milliliter starter for a 5-gallon batch. But you can start with a 70% pitching rate and go from there. Temperature control, these yeasts are very tolerant of different temperatures and even fluctuating temperatures during fermentation. They're not as susceptible to producing off flavors as other ale strains are at like high temperatures. In fact, at high temperatures, they'll express themselves usually in a more fruity, pleasant kind of a way. So they'll produce more fruity esters. And but if you want to reduce the characteristics of the Kveik, then you can ferment down at a 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. But some of these Kveik cultures can go up to like 107 degrees Fahrenheit without being killed, and they're actually fermented that way by the farmhouse brewers. They were selected by the brewers to ferment that hot. And the reason why people think of Norway as being cold, but the reality is that it just takes a lot of energy to cool wort from boiling or near boiling all the way down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So these yeasts just adapted to making good flavor. They were selected because they made good flavor at these warmer temperatures where you didn't have to spend a day cooling the wort all the way down to 70 degrees. Much more convenient if you're making wort on a farm and there's no cooling technology. At the higher temperatures, you're going to get a much faster fermentation. It'll finish sometimes in 1 day, 2 days. You could consume the beer after that if you wanted to. I highly recommend that you don't do that. I find that when I brew with a Kveik quite a bit, almost exclusively if I'm not making sour beers or Brett beers or saisons. They still benefit from conditioning. So after you finish the fermentation, let the beer condition for a couple days, and then even do some cold conditioning to help that beer settle out. I find that even though there's a lot of good flocculating Kveik strains, there's some that also just aren't, and you just get better flavor as the beer ages. I find like 2 to 3 weeks after fermentation is where they start to taste really good, or start to taste better. So I don't think that using Kveik is really a great shortcut kind of a thing. There's also a few strains out there that are considered lager-like. I don't think that they really replace lager yeast, but they do ferment very cleanly. That would be Bootleg Biology's Oslo, Lutra from Omega Yeast Labs, and Crispy with a K from Escarpment Labs. All of those you can get online in the United States. If you want to do something like, I don't know, maybe like a Kolsch-like beer, or or something that doesn't express a lot of yeast esters. Always go to the website of the yeast manufacturer to see what their recommendations are on fermentation temperature. You can also reference something called, you can just Google it, Farmhouse Yeast Registry, and this will tell you what the farmhouse brewers do. So what temperature they ferment at, whether they top crop or bottom crop. We'll talk about that a little bit, and other general techniques if you want to mimic what the farmhouse brewers are doing, which I recommend because that's what the yeast are used to fermenting. That's how they're used to fermenting under those conditions. Another technique, good advice here is to double up on your yeast nutrient addition, especially if you're brewing a low or moderate gravity beer. These yeasts have adapted to fermenting high gravity beers. That's what they do in most of the Norwegian farmhouse traditions. So somewhere around 8-9% alcohol is what they're targeting usually. The more malt you have, the higher gravity, the more nutrients, the more free amino nitrogen is going to be in the wort as well. So if you're brewing a lower gravity style, you might want to double up on your yeast nutrient. Also, for your mash pH target like a slightly higher mash pH, because the Kveiks do tend to ferment or finish at kind of a lower pH. Statistically, it's around 0.25 pH points lower than typical ale or lager strains. So maybe target like a 5.4 to 5.6 pH in your mash, and that can help offset kind of a lower pH or tartness from a lower pH. That is strain dependent. Not all Kveiks do that, but in general, I think that's a good place to start. And then you can adjust from there. Personally, I also like to do open fermentation for the first couple of days. I think that the access to oxygen helps the Kveik. That's the way they do them in the farmhouse breweries. They open ferment them. So I think you get better character from them also. Another point to make is to if you want to respect the farmhouse brewers, they've asked kind of collectively as a community to give credit to the farmhouse brewer that gave away their Kveik for free. You don't obviously have to do that, but it's kind of a nice thing to do. So let's talk about characteristics of Kveik a little bit. They're not phenolic, so phenols are like pepper and clove. They can also be medicinal and smoky. You'll see phenols talked about a lot in Saison brewing or Hefeweizen brewing or sour beer brewing. Kveik is actually not phenolic. Most wild yeasts are phenolic, so the farmhouse brewers actually selected against this, just like English ale brewers and brewers from around Europe. So these yeasts tend to be more on the fruitier side, although they can have really a wide range of fruit characteristics from guava to orange to peach. Some of them have kind of weirder flavors like an umami mushroom character. There's a wide array of flavors that you can get from these Kveiks. There's something like 40 or 50 different Kveiks that have been collected so far, and they're all fairly unique. I also find that they tend to produce more body. So you might want to, if you're making like a New England IPA or something like that, you might want to go easy on your dextrin malt or something like that. To keep that in mind. I think that Kveik pairs really well with smoked malts if you happen to be into smoked beers. Kveik and smoked malts go very well together. So other resources I would say is to buy the book by Lars Garshall, Traditional Brewing Techniques. Look at his blog. It's just if you Google Lars Garshall beer, you'll find his blog. His blog is amazing. He goes to these farmhouse breweries and he just documents everything that they're doing as much as he can. His most recent one was on Sati Brewing, a Finnish brewer who brews Sati in a traditional manner. And that was a real interesting read. And also milkthefunk.com/wiki, search for Kveik. One other thing on pronunciation, I forgot to cover this at the beginning. I say it Kveik. Most Norwegians will say it Kveik. There's also kind of a dialect within Norway where they might say Kveik. And then there's another way to say it, like Kveik, and I haven't really heard many Norwegians say it that way, so I don't give too much credence to that pronunciation. I just say Kveik. Another aspect of it is that when Norwegians speak, they don't have a W sound, but they kind of have this lazy. If they're speaking really quickly, they might lazily pronounce the V, and it sounds like a W. So they'll say like Kveik, but that's not. That's just because of the dialect. So it's Kveik is the best way to say it. And if anybody has any questions, shoot me a message on Facebook or Instagram. My Instagram is Dan_ABA_, or Dan Pixley on Facebook. And good luck in the competition. Cheers.